Tonight, less than 2 weeks before he takes office, Donald Trump lays out what he's planning and a series of threats. The president-elect refuses to rule out the use of military force to take control of Greenland and the Panama Canal. He also confirms how he wants NATO members to more than double their spending target on defense. And gives a stark warning about the consequences if Hamas doesn't release its remaining Israeli hostages by the time he's sworn in.
All hell will break out in the Middle East. And it will not be good for Hamas, and it will not be good, frankly, for anyone.
Coming up, we'll hear from a British surgeon who's volunteered in a shattered Gaza hospital. He told me hell is already there. Also tonight, Mark Zuckerberg upends his social media giant's fact-checking program in the US, changes he puts down in part to Donald Trump's return. Plus, the race to find survivors in Tibet, where a powerful earthquake has killed at least 126 people. And how calls for a cricket boycott have put Afghanistan's disappearing women back into the global spotlight. That's all coming up on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening. As far as news conferences go, it was extraordinary. A few hours ago, Donald Trump further outlined his expansionist agenda less than a fortnight before he returns to the White House. He said he wanted to take back control of the Panama Canal and seize Greenland from Denmark, and wouldn't rule out using military or economic action to achieve his aims. He claimed that he had saved NATO and called on alliance members to up their defense spending target to 5%. All this on the day Meta, the company which owns Facebook and Instagram, appeared to bend to the political headwinds of the incoming administration. Tonight, we have 4 correspondents standing by to assess what we've learned about the shape of Trump 2.0. But let's get started with this report from David Blevins in Washington.
2 weeks from inauguration, he hailed a new golden age for America. But the president-elect wandered far off script. From the election...
They're still counting the vote in some areas. Can you believe this?
...to justice.
Nobody's ever won so many cases as I have.
And the environment.
The windmills are driving the whales crazy.
Donald Trump has often been critical of NATO and used this platform to urge European countries to pay their bills, increase their contribution as a percentage of GDP.
I think NATO should have 5%, yeah. Well, you can't do it at 2%. I mean, at 2%, every country, if you're going to have a country in a regular military, you're at 4%. I think they should be, they're in dangerous territory. I think it should be, they can all afford it, but they should be at 5%, not 2%.
But with war raging in Gaza, a fragile peace in the Lebanon and instability in Syria, his remarks on the Middle East will cause real alarm.
If those hostages aren't back, I don't want to hurt your negotiation. If they're not back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East. And it will not be good for Hamas, and it will not be good, frankly, for anyone. All hell will break out. I don't have to say anymore, but that's what it is.
He vowed to take control of Greenland, where Don Jr. touched down earlier and spoke to his father by phone.
The welcome was spectacular. It's pretty amazing.
Well, that's great. Well, you go have a good time, everybody, and we're going to treat you well, and you know that, and just take care of yourselves.
The president-elect is refusing to rule out military or economic coercion in his pursuit of Greenland and the Panama Canal.
I can't assure you, you're talking about Panama and Greenland. No, I can't assure you on either of those two. But I can say this, we need them for economic security. The Panama Canal was built for our military.
He claimed the Panama Canal deal had cost Jimmy Carter the White House. The timing of his criticism unfortunate, as the late president's coffin was transported from Atlanta, Georgia to Washington, D.C. ahead of his state funeral later this week. Some might say this was vintage Trump, speaking off the cuff, or a negotiating tactic. But things do feel different this time. People seem resigned to the fact that he won the election and that they have to take what he says at face value. America is bracing for change, maybe more of it than expected.
We're going to be changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, which has a beautiful ring.
Donald Trump is back. The United States and the world holds its breath. David Blevins, Sky News in Washington.
And David joins us now at the White House. David, I mean, as you said in your report, this was a wide-ranging sort of briefing. It was over an hour long, and in many ways it felt very much like, you know, Trump back to the future, at times rambling even.
That's right, Yalda. Not very long ago, just before the election, people thought the Donald Trump era was behind them. It was over. Today's press conference, unconventional as it was a visual and dramatic reminder of the fact that the Trump era is far from over. Just imagine for a moment if President Joe Biden threatened a land grab of Greenland, threatened to take control of the Panama Canal, ruled out using military or economic coercion in order to do so, and threatened to impose fierce tariffs on Mexico and on Canada, never mind making inflammatory statements about the Middle East and about NATO. There would be bewilderment. People would be shocked. But this wasn't President Biden. This was incoming President Trump just 14 days before inauguration.
Yeah, and David, how has this, as you say, 14 days before inauguration, this press conference been received?
Well, I don't think anyone can say they were surprised, really, because America has been here before. America had 4 years of Donald Trump. America had a choice to make, and America has chosen to put him back into the White House for another 4 years. So I think Republicans who are still celebrating their election victory will be jubilant, largely, about these very hardline statements. And as for Democrats who are still, I suppose, nursing their wounds from their election defeat, there is a sense of resignation about the fact that they did lose the election, that he is going to be the 47th President of the United States, and that therefore they just have to get used to the fact that they're going on a wild ride for the next 4 years, and Donald Trump really is going to carry out some of the things he's threatening to do. So I suppose there's a sense of buckle up.
Yeah, absolutely. David, thanks so much. Well, David mentioned the Middle East there. Donald Trump was insistent a deal will be done to return the remaining Gaza hostages before he takes office. Let's go straight to our Alistair Bunkle, who joins me now live from Jerusalem. And Ali, we've heard Donald Trump actually, well, we haven't heard him say this, but he did put out, a statement with very similar words a few weeks ago on X, where he said there would be hell to pay if the hostages weren't released by the time he comes into office.
Yeah, in that respect, what he had to say today was not new, and actually the phrase or the variation of the phrase "all hell will break loose" is also something that he and some of his aides and spokespeople used in different contexts during the presidential election campaign. It's tough language, it's threatening language. What's not clear, particularly in relation to here in the Middle East, is what he means by it, or what he even could mean by it when he says that all hell will break loose if the hostages aren't released soon. I mean, what is he suggesting could happen, or what is he suggesting his government, his US military could do in Gaza, for example, if the hostages aren't released beyond his inauguration? I mean, is he suggesting perhaps he could put military pressure on Iran in some form in order to in turn get them to put pressure on Hamas? I don't think Donald Trump, I mean, we know that he doesn't like to be embroiled in wars. He doesn't want to be embroiled in another Middle Eastern war, so I don't think that's necessarily a reality. I mean, sanctions on Iran have been proven to be pretty ineffective at times in the past. So it's big, threatening language without necessarily an enormous amount of substance behind it. But it's clearly He wants to see a deal. I think there's probably a little bit of a political wrestle now that if a deal were to come in the coming weeks, who would be able to claim credit for it, Trump or the outgoing Biden administration? I do think actually what is more notable is that Stephen Witkoff, his new Middle East envoy, says that he's going to head to Doha, to Qatar, where some of the talks are taking place in the coming days. There is genuine hope that progress is being made, that the more traditional channels away from threatening language, the negotiations, the diplomacy is starting to have some sort of effect. It's moving very slowly, but clearly all sides, the Qataris, the Egyptians, the Israelis and Hamas say that they are willing to do a deal as well. But of course, both the current US administration and the incoming US administration want to see that deal happen as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We spoke to the Qatari Prime Minister a few weeks ago, and he said that he feels more hopeful that a deal will be struck this time more than at any other point throughout the last year. Ali, thank you so much. And we will be, of course, speaking to a doctor who has travelled to Gaza a little later in the programme. But let's go to our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, who joins me now. And Deborah, no surprises, really, that Donald Trump raised the issue of defence spending in his press conference. This is part of what we heard him say the first time round, way back in 2016, when he's sort of said, why are we, the ones that are doing all of the heavy lifting? Why are these European allies and partners not doing the same? At times he has threatened to pull out of NATO, and now he's he's confirmed a report that came out a few weeks ago in the Financial Times, which had alluded to the fact that Trump was, sort of saying, well, it's actually 5% that I want to see the defence spending raised to now.
Yes, which, if he's going to be taken at his word and that is a new target that he would like all NATO members to meet, then that would also include the United States, which would mean a hugely significant increase in defence spending. They're currently at about 3.38% of national income on defence. And given the size of the economy, then that is a huge portion. But for European governments, they will have been bracing for this, but hearing the reality of it will surely be ringing alarm bells, not least here in the UK, where for Sir Keir Starmer, he has yet to even set out what he's described as defence spending being put on a path to 2.5%. So half of that new target. The UK currently officially spends just over 2%, and increasing it to 2.5%, defence insiders say isn't going to be enough. If the Prime Minister sticks to that target, then he really does risk being seen by the new Trump administration as just not being credible when it comes to defence and to maintaining what the UK outwardly presents itself to the world as being the biggest defence spender within NATO in Europe and having the most powerful European military within the alliance. So it comes down to choice. Is the Prime Minister going to stick with the goals that he's very clearly set out, which are all about economic growth, cutting hospital waiting lists, increasing the number of housing, or is he and the Chancellor going to have to really think again if they want to keep Donald Trump on side and look again at defence spending, or maybe risk falling into that category that Donald Trump again reminded people of today, that if you're not hitting the NATO target, then the US might not come to your defence. And yes, the target at the moment is 2%, which the UK is hitting. But if it increases and the UK doesn't increase too, then we could fall below that radar and into that danger group.
Yeah, absolutely, Deborah. Thank you so much for all of your analysis there. Let's get more on this. I'm joined now by Charlie Cooper, former special advisor at both the US Departments of Justice and Defense. Thank you so much, Charlie, for joining us here on the program. We were saying a little bit earlier on the show that, this was very much classic Donald Trump, the threats against, both friends and foes, talking about allies in a way, in a very threatening way, certainly when it came to Greenland, for example, and NATO partners, where he has said, I need you to up your defense spending, which is what we were just talking about now. Just your take on what you heard this afternoon.
Yalda, I would say that Trump's press conference today was absolutely on brand. It was absolutely fantastic in the sense that it was totally unpredictable. If you ask most foreign policy advisors, they would peg the Middle East crisis, Ukraine's war with Russia, China's aggression towards Taiwan as some of the major foreign policy issues that we need to address globally. And yet Donald Trump has managed, even before he's sworn back into office, to throw into the conversation whether or not Canada should be the 51st state of the United States, whether or not the U.S. wants to go back and take the Panama Canal, which was given to the Panamanians back during the Carter administration in the late 70s, and whether or not NATO spending should go up. That is, of course, less predictable or more predictable. But some of the conversations that we're having range from the very thoughtful and very serious about what NATO's role in the world should be to extraneous saber rattling about Greenland and Canada, which leaves world leaders guessing about when Donald Trump talks about one thing, is he serious about other things? When you were talking about the increase in defense spending, he's calling for a 5% of GDP towards NATO from all native countries. That has massive implications across the NATO countries and has massive implications for NATO's adversaries. And yet the same day they're talking about that, they're trying to figure out if Donald Trump is serious about taking Greenland. This was sort of vintage Trump, and I think we need to get ready for another 4 years of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you say, it's classic Trump, vintage Trump. It's totally on brand. We saw it the first time round, this kind of almost like, madman theory. And he has said it himself. He sort of talked about his relationship with the Chinese, for example, and this whole idea around great power competition with the Chinese and the rivalry. And he said, they think I'm crazy. President Xi thinks I'm crazy. They don't know what I'm going to do. And I wonder if that is what he wants to do almost before he's even come, to office, to kind of almost muddy the waters as much as possible before he starts.
Yalda, I think you're exactly right. I think one of the tools in Trump's toolbox, maybe the main one, is keeping people guessing. And you all in the UK see it, and we see it back here in the United States, not just on foreign policy, but on domestic policy. He can change his opinions on taxes, on education, on the environment, you name it, on any given week, any given day, and people are left off guard. They find themselves unable to predict what he's going to do next and therefore unable to plan. If you take that at the macro level, if you're a foreign leader trying to understand where you stand in relation to the United States, whether you're an ally or an enemy, whether you're a partial ally and partial enemy. Panama has been an ally of the United States for decades and decades and decades, and now they're wondering if they have to defend their national sovereignty if the U.S. decides to go back in and try to take the canal. You really are left guessing. So I think your point about almost wanting to be seen as the crazy person in the room is very much a tactical decision on Donald Trump's part. I think he thinks it makes him more powerful on the world stage and gives him leverage. It will remain to be seen whether or not it does. And the question now we have to ask ourselves is, will he be true to his word like he was on certain things, like tariffs, for instance? Or will he back down as he did on other things, like leaving NATO, as he threatened to do in the past and ended up not doing it, or building a wall along the Mexican border, which he never ended up building? It remains to be seen which Donald Trump's going to show up for office on January 20th.
Yeah, absolutely, and beyond. And as our correspondent said earlier, buckle up. It's going to be quite a ride. Charlie Cooper, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme.
Of course, Yalda, thank you.
Now to Meta, which owns Facebook, and Meta scrapping its US fact-checking program in a policy reversal welcomed by Donald Trump. Let's bring in our science and technology editor, Tom Clark. And Tom, we've been dissecting what Donald Trump has been saying, but already we're seeing these tech billionaires, these tech bros, kissing the ring, making their pilgrimage. And Zuckerberg today has said one of the reasons, he did this is because Donald Trump will be coming into office.
Yeah, he pretty much has as much confirmed that. He said that we've reached a tipping point following the election that has helped, in part precipitated this move by Meta. He tried to make out also it was in their interest that they'd been getting it wrong with their content moderation being the way it was. It was introducing too much error and too much bias and blocking people from factual, accurate posts from Facebook that should be there. But let's not really forget here, this is all about building bridges with the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration, bridges that were comprehensively burned during the 2020 election campaign. Let's not forget Donald Trump called him Zucker Schmuck, threatened him with jail over what he said was Facebook's attempt to influence the campaign, effectively losing the election. There's a lot of work to do, and Mark Zuckerberg is going to need friends on Capitol Hill and in the White House, because the world is not as it once was. There are legal pressures and threats to big tech companies in Washington and around the rest of the world that there weren't before. So that's something that they're going to need to stand up to. And also he has to be allowed to thrive and get on with what he's doing. I think what's worrying observers is Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg himself represented liberal values, even if most liberal and democracy and online safety campaigners didn't exactly love his wealth and power. They at least saw him as somebody who had previously campaigned on liberal issues like undocumented migrants in the US, like on access to healthcare and women's rights. And we've already seen that being eroded. We've seen him now have Thanksgiving dinner at Mar-a-Lago. He's donated $1 million to Trump's inaugural fund, and now this capitulation. On top of that, putting the UFC CEO Dana White, a big champion of Donald Trump and a highly recognisable face for MAGA Republicans, on the board of Meta. Is this another big tech boss sliding towards the right, as we've seen with Elon Musk? Certainly he hasn't said anything that would come even close to what Elon Musk is on the record of having done, isn't starting to interfere with other things or flex his tech companies' muscles. But it's certainly a significant shift for a very powerful and very wealthy company in the US. Yeah, absolutely. Tom, thank you so much. You're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Still lots to come after the break. The calls for England to boycott a cricket match against the Afghan men's team, whilst women remain banned from taking part in sport by the Taliban. Stay with us for that.
Paris reverberated to the sights, sounds and smells of conflict.
There's a focal point to all this anger, and that is Emmanuel Macron.
I'm Adam Parsons, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
There are dozens of people desperately clambering to get onto that boat. It is a chaotic scene, but it's being watched by dozens of French police officers on the beach.
I've reported on migration across Europe, close up on the ground, understanding that sense of desperation and meeting the criminal gangs behind it.
This old fishing boat set off from the Libyan port of Tobruk. There were 606 people who were on board.
So we've been distributing life jackets to all the people on board this boat, and now the first person is coming on board.
This is the ugly side of Italian football.
In Italy, everything is really organized.
Football's problems with hooliganism, racism were just dormant, and now they're back and they're getting worse.
We cover so many countries, languages and cultures and work hard to gain trust to bring you the full story first.
Help is slowly reaching these places.
It's not just homes, but whole streets like this one that have been reduced to rubble and dust.
This is a picture of destruction.
Everywhere you look in this mountaintop community, there is absolute devastation.
These are the settlers in waiting, keen to start a new life, to annex Gaza for Israel.
The least we can do is just kick them out of our land.
Gaza, which is just 2 miles in that direction, is under attack again. Getting the chance to tell people's stories, it's a privilege.
There's always more to the news than a headline. We want to discover, to delve a little deeper, to find out what's really going on. Explanation, analysis, the people at the heart of every story. I'm Neil Patterson, and this is the Sky News Daily Podcast. So, by the end, we'll hopefully all understand what's going on in the world just that little better. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. A new start to Sunday.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem. Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
Welcome back. We've got some breaking news for you now. And the Biden administration has tonight accused Sudan's Rapid Support Forces militia and allied fighters of committing genocide in a conflict that's killed tens of thousands of people. Let's go straight to our Africa correspondent, Yusra El-Bagir, who joins me now. Yusra, you and I have been talking about this conflict for the last year. Of course, it's been going on for about 2 years now, more than 2 years, or almost 2 years, and you've been covering it extensively. But this is another development, given the devastation that we have seen in Sudan.
And this is huge, Yalda. And as we know, the threshold for proving genocide is very high. You have to prove intent of destroying a group of a particular ethnicity. And the RSF not only have a history of that with the Darfur genocide that Colin Powell, US Secretary of State, 2004 designated a genocide. They were a militia run by Hemeti who were carrying out state-sanctioned atrocities. And now 20 years later, we've seen his forces do this on a mass scale. We've interviewed people who've told us that they were targeted based on the color of their skin, based on their tribe, based on the fact that they are not coming from the Arab tribes that he comes from, that his family members come from, that the RSF leadership tend to come from. So to see the US take this stance with only less than 2 weeks left in office, I think gives a lot of people who've been feeling like they were yelling into the void, a lot of hope that potentially this designation will bring intervention, effective intervention, but also Anthony Blinken also announced sanctions on the RSF's leader, Hemeti. They've said that they have also sanctioned UAE-based companies. And the UAE, of course, has long been credibly accused of backing and arming the RSF in this war. So this does feel like a seminal moment. And when we spent time in Chad, on the border of Darfur, we spoke to people who told us distinctly that they were targeted based on their ethnicity. This man was one of them.
Yeah.
They never entered Arab houses in the neighborhood. They only go to the houses of black people, break in and take.
And
it's quite a short statement, but it sums up a lot, doesn't it, Yalda? I mean, I think we've spoken about this multiple times over the course of the war, but just to see that recognized is quite something.
Yeah, absolutely, as you say. And, you know, your reports are on our website and people should go there and have a look at your coverage. It really gives you a sense of what's happening on the ground. Yusra, thank you so much.
Thank you, Yalda.
Now, during his first term, Donald Trump's administration signed a deal with the Taliban to end 2 decades of war, which set a timeline for the US and its allies to leave. The Taliban was then supposed to negotiate with the Western-backed Afghan government, but that, of course, never happened. Instead, the government collapsed amid the Biden administration's chaotic withdrawal in 2021. Since the Taliban's takeover, they've launched a campaign against the women of Afghanistan in an effort to ensure all their basic human rights are denied. Most recently, denying women the right to speak loudly to each other in public and even to look out of windows. The treatment of women has drawn global condemnation and calls now by British politicians for England to boycott a cricket match against the Afghanistan team next month. Well, let's just talk through some of those restrictions. The Taliban has effectively erased women from public life, severely restricting their movement and banning them from places like parks, gyms and salons. Mothers can't take their children to the local park, for example. They're also forbidden from studying or attending secondary school beyond the age of 12. And UNICEF warns that families grappling with extreme poverty are selling daughters into marriage, including young girls. In October, the Taliban banned women from praying loudly or reciting the Quran in front of other women. And in December, women training as midwives and nurses say they were told not to return to class, cutting off one of the only routes left to further education. Well, let's speak now to Fariba Rezai, a judo athlete who in 2004 became the first woman to represent Afghanistan in the Olympic Games. Fariba, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. Of course, you are also now living in exile. Women across the country, as we've said, face all sorts of restrictions. But let's talk first about this call for the England team to boycott a match with Afghanistan's team. What are your views? Because, you know, there are those who believe that the team shouldn't be punished for the policies of the Taliban. And there are others who say, you know, the Taliban uses this team as a propaganda tool.
Hello, Yalda. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, first of all, I was very happy to see that some MPs in UK came together and recognized the Taliban's harsh treatment of women in Afghanistan and called for the boycott of Afghan men's cricket team, because that's the only justice to do for the Afghan female athletes, because the Taliban have banned sport for women. And when we say they ban, it's not just a ban. They have also imposed a strict punishment if women are caught or seen going to the gyms, sports facilities, or playing sport. So that's the right thing to do, because the Afghan men's cricket team is representing a gender apartheid regime, a regime that is being imposed on the Afghan women, a regime that has declared war against women in Afghanistan. If we look into details of the Afghan men's cricket team, the players and the team members of the cricket team, they are seen and supported as like celebrities. They travel luxuriously, and they receive $17 million annually for their trips, for the sponsorship, and for their support, where Afghan women are not even allowed to go to school. So this is unacceptable, and this needs to be stopped effective and immediately.
Yeah, the Taliban often are seen taking photographs, for example, with the team. They praise them after a match or a win. You know, they talk about the importance of this team. So do you think a boycott will be felt by the Taliban? They'll be forced to sit up and pay attention, given, you know, men across this country who are, by the way, allowed to watch these matches. And as you say, women aren't even allowed to, in most cases, in parts of the country, not even allowed to leave their homes. They've put out an edict most recently saying that windows that are built in new homes should not face the street, so that people can't see into the homes and look at women. Do you think the Taliban will feel this if there is a boycott?
Yes, boycott is the answer. Why? Because the Taliban need concrete actions against the violation of human rights and women's rights. And also they have violated the ICC Charter, International Cricket Council's Charter, and gender equality mandate imposed and supported by the ICC. Because the world has been issuing strongly worded statements to the Taliban, but those statements and messages don't even register with the Taliban, and the Taliban don't even care. What we need is to set a precedent with the Taliban by boycotting them, to show that what they're doing is unacceptable. The reason that the Taliban have been able to continue this restriction and kept issuing edicts against women's rights is because there are no consequences against their actions. And I want everybody to understand that there is no separation between Afghanistan's support and the Taliban. I want everybody to understand and to know that the Afghan support is the Taliban and Taliban or the Afghan support. For example, the Afghan National Olympic Committee is the Taliban and Taliban or the National Olympic Committee. And the Taliban or the cricket team and the cricket team is the Taliban. Why? Because after their recent victory, one of the leaders of the Taliban, Amir Khan, he directly spoke with the captain of the Afghan men's cricket team and congratulated him. Taliban have been supporting the cricket team, and the cricket team have been supporting the Taliban. So this is the right thing to do, to boycott them. And another question we need to ask as viewers, as human rights supporters, is that why the British team, why the British coaches are working for the Taliban and supporting gender apartheid in Afghanistan? For example, Jonathan Throat, he's the captain of Afghan men's team and is supporting this. So the cricket team is the Taliban and Taliban are the cricket team. We must take that into account, and we must know that who are representing what, who are they capable of.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there, but Friba John, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a wonderful day.
Now, at least 126 people have been killed after a strong earthquake struck Western China, with hundreds more injured and missing. The 7.1 magnitude quake struck the mountainous Tigray area in the autonomous region of Tibet just after 9 o'clock this morning local time. The epicenter was 14 miles from Tibet's second largest city, just north of the border with Nepal and 50 miles northwest of Mount Everest. Our Asia correspondent, Nicole Johnson, has this report.
In the heart of the Himalayas, an earthquake devastates remote mountain villages. The epicenter is Tigray, a county in China's majority Buddhist region of Tibet, and the number of dead is rising. The US reports the magnitude of the quake is 7.1. It is strong. This area is prone to earthquakes.
Because of the colliding between the Indian plate and the Eurasia plate, so a large amount of tectonic strain or energy has been accumulated, and then this energy will be released partly by earthquakes. Therefore, this region is earthquake prone.
Whole homes reduced to bricks. Many people are missing. And it is winter. The days are short. So too is the window for recovery. It's a desperate search to find people still alive, somewhere under all that rubble. And it is bitterly cold. At night, temperatures drop below freezing. Rescuers and soldiers scour the debris, backed up by drones, eyes in the sky for those hard-to-reach places.
Our next priority is to visit each village, as the affected area is quite extensive. We aim to understand the disaster situation in each village and locate trapped individuals to provide preliminary reports for the larger rescue teams.
There's been aftershocks, many of them, one after the other. And tremors too, in India, Nepal and Bhutan. The whole region is on edge. Mountain roads need to be cleared, and the challenge ahead is formidable. On this so-called rooftop of the world, the Earth has delivered a tremendous shock, and the days ahead will be hard going. Nicole Johnston, Sky News.
This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up on the programme, as Donald Trump threatens all hell will break out in the Middle East, we hear from a surgeon who says conditions in Gaza can hardly get any worse after 15 months of war.
I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. Donald Trump, it would appear, is about to learn his fate. There's no doubting the strength of this hurricane as it roars through. Sky News, get the full story first. Do you fear a fourth indictment?
He's from Sky News. He's from Sky News. He's entitled to ask me questions.
Welcome back. It's 15 months to the day since Hamas fighters crossed into Israel from Gaza, killing more than 1,200 men, women and children while taking 250 civilian hostages. Tonight, as we've been hearing, President-elect Donald Trump has promised all hell will break loose if the surviving hostages aren't released by the time he returns to the White House in less than 2 weeks' time. But for the people of Gaza who've suffered unimaginable death and destruction during the war sparked by those October 7th attacks, how much worse can things really get? Well, earlier I spoke to Professor Nizam Mahmood, a British surgeon who has recently returned after volunteering at the Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. I started by asking about his experience dealing with mass casualties in Gaza on a daily basis.
The situation was shocking, really. I'd been following things quite closely, but I was completely astounded by what I found when I got there. The hospital was in a terrible state. It was, at that time, one of the last hospitals that was functioning in any sense like a hospital. But the wards were crowded, beds were jammed together, people were sleeping on the floors, there were flies everywhere. I would be operating, flies would be landing on the wounds. And we would receive 1 or 2 mass casualty incidents every day. So 10 to 20 dead, 20 to 40 seriously injured. And most of those would be women and children. The equipment was very basic. So at one point I ran out of gauze swabs when I was operating on an 8-year-old child who was bleeding to death. We ran out of disposable gowns, sterile gowns. We ran out of sterile drapes, sterile gloves at various points. So it was not really medicine in any kind of conventional sense.
Have you seen anything like what you did see on the ground working in Gaza?
No, not at all. I've worked in a number of conflict zones. I felt that this was completely different. And indeed, everybody else I talked to who was experienced, who'd worked overseas, felt the same thing. They'd not seen anything like this at all anywhere. I think it's a combination of the conditions in the hospital, the attacks on healthcare staff, on ambulances, on hospitals, the restriction of supplies, the restriction of food, and the constant shelling and bombing of civilians.
You mentioned there the drones, which you've talked about in the past as well. When you testified to the International Development Committee as well, you talked about the sort of sound of the drones, but also the impact of what they were doing to some of the youngest victims.
Yeah, I mean, the drones existed before October the 7th of 2023. Drones have been flying over the occupied territories for some time. And it's important to realise that because the effect that has psychologically on the population. Since the war started, what's happened is that drones have now not just been used for surveillance, but they've been used to actively target people. And we had description after description of drones coming down, usually after a bomb had been dropped or a missile strike, and then picking off civilians quite deliberately and quite persistently, including very young children.
I just want to pick up on your phrase there, the deliberate targeting of civilians. So, you know, Israel says that it issues evacuation orders, whether it's to mobile phones or you know, in other ways, and asks people to leave certain areas that they say is going to be targeted. But you say these drones are operating and doing something completely separate as well.
Well, I think there's absolutely no doubt that there's been deliberate and persistent targeting of civilians in a way that we haven't really seen in this century. There are evacuation orders issued from time to time. Often the bombing starts minutes after those evacuation orders. But there are also many, many examples of bombs being dropped on very, very crowded areas in the so-called safe zone with no warning being given.
What would you say to the international community, given what you've seen? This is also still going on and continues, and yet, you know, people do look away.
Yes, I mean, I would say that history has shown us time and time again when we're faced with these kind of situations, afterwards people then regret not having done enough. I think now is the time to do something. The evidence is overwhelming. I think it's embarrassing for me as a UK citizen that my government is sending arms to facilitate this and is not being adequately critical of Israel in the war crimes that it's committing. I think it's time that the international community took action and tried to help these people who can't leave. They're trapped there. There's no way out, and they're just being massacred day after day.
Just today, Donald Trump, whose inauguration is in about 2 weeks' time, he said that there will be hell to pay if the hostages are not released from Gaza by January 20, when that inauguration takes place. What's your reaction to that, given what you've seen on the ground, when you hear him say all hell will break loose, basically?
I think all hell has broken loose. I think it was bad enough where I was in central Gaza, in northern Gaza. All the reports suggested it's so much worse. Everything's been destroyed. All healthcare facilities have been destroyed. People are being killed wantonly. That's my image of hell.
That was Professor Nizam Mahmoud there. Returning now to a story we brought you earlier, Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, is upending the way fact-checking works on the platforms, adopting a system similar to Elon Musk's X, formerly Twitter. Here's Meta boss Mark Zuckerberg explaining why. Have a listen.
The problem with complex systems is they make mistakes. Even if they accidentally censor just 1% of posts, that's millions of people. We've reached a point where it's just too many mistakes and too much censorship. The recent elections also feel like a cultural tipping point towards once again prioritizing speech. So we're going to get back to our roots and focus on reducing mistakes, simplifying our policies, and restoring free expression on our platforms.
That was Mark Zuckerberg. Well, I'm joined now by Bruce Daisley, former Twitter Vice President for Europe, the Middle East and Asia. Thank you so much, Bruce, for joining us here on the programme. Just your reaction to what you've been hearing from Mark Zuckerberg. And I guess, you know, you worked for Twitter before Elon Musk took over, but just, you know, the way that the company has now evolved as well.
Yeah, well, he said this quite a bit out loud, didn't he? He said the fact that this was a reaction to the election. And I think what we've witnessed in the course of the last 6 weeks is a lot of tech firms have found themselves scrambling to try and ensure that they aren't the ones that, when Donald Trump wants to kick the cat, that they're sitting at his feet. And so we've seen a whole load of tech leaders. I guess they're becoming tech oligarchs because they're wielding a substantial amount of power as well as wealth, but they've headed down to Mar-a-Lago to go and see him. We've been told that everyone from Tim Cook, Jeff Bezos, they've all made their way down there. And I think Mark Zuckerberg, because he was one of the businesses that had previously censored Trump, has done everything he can to get out of the way right now.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, they've made the pilgrimage. They're kissing the ring. In many ways, we don't often see, you know, these tech leaders known as tech bros now, you know, heading towards Washington. They sort of head the other direction because they don't like the talk of regulation or you know, having government interfere too much in their affairs. But in this instance, increasingly, as you say, we're seeing them cozy up to Donald Trump and start to make adjustments to the way that their companies are operating already.
Yeah, it's worth saying that Donald Trump, in passing in the last 12 months, did say that if Mark Zuckerberg did anything to influence the election, he would end up in jail. So it's not necessarily just a covert threat. He's been pretty explicit in saying, in articulating the consequences. And so we've seen this play out now over the course of the last few months. Jeff Bezos pulled an editorial from the Washington Post, which was going to endorse Trump's opponent, Kamala Harris. And we've witnessed just a lot of people are recognising that this is not going to be a normal state of affairs, and they just don't want to be the one that Trump comes for. I think we're going to see more of this. There's a TikTok ban, which is meant to be somewhere in the region of about a week and a half away. It's going to be stayed, but there's strong suggestions that Trump wants to try and do a deal. And I suspect that deal, if it's anything like the deal he tried to do last time, is selling it to one of his friends. So we're entering really, I think, unprecedented and quite perilous times, really, because media owners are really trying to facilitate a different order of things. This fact-checking thing is really worrying. There were dozens of organisations around the world that were funded by Meta to check facts on the website, and now, explicitly because of the election, that's all been taken away. And it's a bad sign, I think, for anyone who cares about the accuracy of media and the accuracy of the information we receive.
Yeah, absolutely. And given, the influence they have on the general public, the algorithms they use, the sort of access to the data they have, it's one thing sort of describing them as sort of tech oligarchs close to now power as well through Donald Trump. It's another, given the kind of control and influence they have to information and the way that the information is disseminated to people.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, look, the definition of an oligarch is someone who's of extreme wealth, who wields significant power, and that's what they are. They're running. Well, they're not only running some of the most potent and powerful sources of data in the world, but right now, Elon Musk would probably lay claim to running part of the incoming government. So it's quite alarming. It's certainly, it doesn't feel democratic. And I guess, we only need to look at what's happening with Elon Musk's threats. Yesterday, he had a poll on his platform, Twitter, X. He had a poll that ran all day that said, should America come in and invade Britain to free it from its government? Now, that's kind of interfering in other countries, and albeit that he will frame it as a joke, it's quite sinister when it's coming from someone who's spent the last 6 weeks in a cottage at Mar-a-Lago, living as close as he can to the incoming president. So it's just, I think, a sign that we're about to enter a very spiky, prickly, and slightly daunting period of politics.
Yeah, and unprecedented. But what we're also seeing is this division appearing between the MAGA diehards, the nativists, and, these tech leaders who are frankly not necessarily isolationists. They do look to the future, and Donald Trump has brought these two camps together. It'll be interesting to see how that evolves. But I guess on Mark Zuckerberg, he has come a long way. I mean, just last year, Donald Trump described him as the enemy of the people.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, he's restyled his whole look, and he's restyled all his opinions. He's clearly of the mind that he just wants to be. I mean, when Donald Trump had that first assassination attempt, Zuckerberg made it clear that his opinion of it was that Trump was a badass. And for a candidate who's always loved sycophancy, it's a clear message that, look, I'm trying to be on your side. The departure of Nick Clegg, departure of Nick Clegg last week to be replaced by a MAGA loyalist, again, is another sign.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've run out of time on the programme. Bruce, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. Well, that's it from me and the World team tonight. Next up, it's the news at 10. Good night.